The morning Rebecca Cooper buried her husband in Missouri soil, she decided she would not spend another winter dying slowly in a place that held nothing but grief. It was the spring of 1872, and the world west of the Mississippi was still being carved open like a wound that refused to heal, still raw and wild and promising in equal measure. Thomas Cooper had been a good man, a farmer with calloused hands and a gentle laugh, and the fever had taken him in February without a single word of warning. He had gone to bed complaining of a headache and never opened his eyes again. Rebecca had sat beside him for 3 days, pressing cold cloths to his forehead, whispering prayers into the dark, and then she had sat beside his grave for another 3 days doing the same thing until her neighbor, Mrs. Hartwell, had come and physically pulled her up from the frozen ground and pressed a cup of hot coffee into her hands. "You cannot stay here," Mrs. Hartwell had said, not unkindly. "A woman alone on 40 acres with a bad well and a leaking roof is not living, Rebecca. It is waiting to die." Rebecca Cooper was 26 years old, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, and she had never in her life been accused of lacking courage. She had walked across a creek on a fallen log when she was 8 years old just because her older brother said she couldn't. She had argued with the county schoolteacher about the proper interpretation of a passage from Shakespeare until the man went red in the face and conceded the point. She had married Thomas not because anyone expected her to, but because she had genuinely loved him, and she had mourned him with the full force of everything she had. But Mrs. Hartwell was right. There was nothing left to do in this place except wait. So she sold the 40 acres, settled her debts, packed everything she owned into a single covered wagon that smelled like pine sap and old flour, and she joined the spring immigrant train gathering in Independence, Missouri, bound for the Oregon Territory. The wagon master's name was Doyle, a heavy-set man of 50 with a sun-scarred neck and a voice like gravel rolling in a tin can. He charged her the fee, looked her over with the skeptical expression men always reserved for women traveling without husbands, and told her she was welcome to join provided she kept up with the pace and did not expect special treatment because of her gender. Rebecca had smiled at him with every ounce of pleasantness she could manufacture and told him she had never expected special treatment in her life and did not intend to start now. Doyle had grunted, which she took to mean they understood each other. There were 31 wagons in the train, families mostly, with their children and their milk cows and their furniture wrapped in burlap. A minister and his wife traveling to establish a church in the Willamette Valley. 2 brothers with a shared dream of cattle ranching. A handful of single men who kept to themselves and eyed each other with the professional wariness of people who had learned that trust was a luxury best extended slowly. And then there was Patrick Abbott. She noticed him on the first morning because he was not part of the wagon train. He appeared at the edge of the gathering camp in Independence just as the wagons were lining up to move out, sitting on a dark bay horse with the easy, unhurried posture of a man who had spent more of his life in the saddle than out of it. He was somewhere around 30, lean and weathered, with dark eyes that caught the morning light and gave nothing away. His hat was pulled low. He wore a canvas duster that had seen considerable use, and there was a Winchester rifle in the scabbard across his saddle and 2 Colt revolvers on his hips, which was not unusual for the frontier, but something about the precise, deliberate way he wore them suggested he was not carrying them for show. He spoke to Doyle for a few minutes at the head of the column, and Doyle nodded, and then Patrick Abbott took a position riding off to the right of the wagons, and they began to move. Rebecca asked the minister's wife, a cheerful woman named Clara Marsh, if she knew who the man on the bay horse was. "Scout, I believe," Clara said, shielding her eyes from the morning sun. "Or a hired rider of some kind. Mr. Doyle mentioned something about hiring extra protection this season. The trail has been troubled." "Troubled how?" Rebecca asked. "Road agents mostly. There have been raids on immigrant wagons. Nothing too terrible, they say, but enough to make a careful man want extra eyes on the flanks." Rebecca looked back at the man on the bay horse. He was not looking at her. He was watching the tree line to the north with the focused, patient attention of someone who had learned to watch things that other people forgot to watch. She turned back to her oxen and did not think about him again for the better part of 3 days. The first week on the trail was everything Rebecca had been warned it would be, and nothing she had truly been prepared for. The roads west of Independence were still soft from the spring rains, and the wagons churned them into a misery of mud that sucked at the wheels and exhausted the animals by midday. She walked beside her wagon most of the time because she was afraid to add her own weight to the burden her 2 oxen were already carrying, and by the end of each day, her boots were caked past the ankle, and her back ached in ways she had not known a back could ache. She made camp, cooked her supper over a fire she built herself, and went asleep as soon as the darkness settled, too tired for anything as indulgent as loneliness. The rider on the bay horse was always there, at the edge of things. She would catch sight of him in the mornings, already up and moving before the camp stirred, riding a circuit around the wagons with that unhurried, watchful quality that she had noticed the first day. In the evenings, when the fires were lit and the families gathered, and the sound of someone's fiddle drifted through the camp, he was somewhere on the perimeter, a shadow among shadows, and she never once saw him sitting at anyone's fire. On the 4th night, her rear axle cracked. She heard it happen, a sound like a rifle shot in the quiet evening, followed by the terrible sensation of the wagon tilting hard to the right, and then she was scrambling down from the seat and around to the back to assess the damage, and the damage was significant. The axle had split almost clean through. Another quarter mile and the whole rear end would have come apart. She stood there in the dying light with her hands on her hips and her jaw tight, trying to calculate whether she had the materials to attempt a repair herself. She had a spare wheel, but a spare wheel without a sound axle was no help at all. She needed iron banding and someone who knew how to properly splint a wooden axle, and she needed it before morning because Doyle would not wait for stragglers. "You have a spare length of chain," she spun around. Patrick Abbott was standing perhaps 6 feet away, on foot now, his horse tied to the back of the wagon, and he was examining the cracked axle with the steady, dispassionate attention he gave to everything. She had not heard him approach. For a man who was so visible from a distance, he moved with a remarkable quietness up close. "I might," she said, not sure why she was being defensive but feeling it nonetheless. "Do you know how to fix it?" "Done it before," he said, which was not exactly a yes and not exactly a no, but she was in no position to be particular. She found the chain in her supply box, and he found a length of hardwood in the timber she was carrying as building material, and for the next 2 hours they worked in the firelight while the camp settled around them, Rebecca holding things steady while Patrick Abbott wrapped and bound and braced with a practiced efficiency that left no room for small talk and no opening for questions. When it was done, he tested the axle by rocking the wagon on its frame, listened to whatever it told him, and nodded once. "That will hold to Fort Kearny," he said. "You can get a proper repair done there." "Thank you," she said. She meant it fully. "What do I owe you?" He looked at her then directly for the first time in 4 days, and the look was not unkind, but it was measuring, the way a man measures a distance or a weather front or a situation he has not yet decided how to categorize. "Nothing," he said. "That does not seem fair." "Fair does not keep axles from breaking," he said, and then he untied his horse and was gone into the darkness, and Rebecca stood alone beside her wagon listening to the prairie wind and trying to decide what to make of a man like that. His name, she learned the following day from one of the brothers traveling with Cattle Dreams, was Patrick Abbott. Beyond that, opinions varied. The brothers thought he was a former Army scout, mustered out after the war. Clara Marsh's husband, the minister, believed he was simply a man who had learned the trail and hired himself out as a guard, which happened with some regularity. One of the single men at the back of the column, a sharp-featured man named Decker who seemed to know a great deal about everyone, said that he had heard Patrick Abbott was wanted in Kansas for something that had happened 3 years ago, but he said it with the relish of someone who enjoyed being the one who knows things, and Rebecca took it with considerable skepticism. She thought about asking Doyle, but something stopped her. Some private sense that it was not her business, that the man had fixed her axle without asking anything of her, and was doing his job on the perimeter without troubling anyone, and whatever else he was or had been was not her concern. But she watched him, in the peripheral, careful way she had learned to watch things she was trying not to be too interested in. She noticed that he checked the horses of the wagons at the rear of the column each evening, quietly, without drawing attention to it. She noticed that when the train forded a shallow river on the 9th day, and one of the families lost a crate of supplies to the current, Patrick Abbott was the one who rowed downstream and pulled it out before it sank, and he returned it without ceremony and was gone again before the family had finished thanking him. She noticed that he never ate with the rest of the group, but that he always seemed, by morning, to have been everywhere that needed watching during the night. She was not falling in love with him. She told herself this with some firmness. She was 26 years old, 8 weeks out from burying her husband, and she was traveling to Oregon to start a new life, not to complicate the one she was in the middle of escaping. She was simply a woman who paid attention, and there was something about Patrick Abbott worth paying attention to. Fort Kearny arrived on the 14th day, rising up out of the Nebraska plain with its timber stockade and its American flag, and the sound of cavalry drilling in the parade ground. And Rebecca got her axle properly repaired by the post blacksmith, a gruff and excellent man named Jonas who charged her fairly, and did not patronize her about not having a husband present to authorize the work, which she appreciated. She also bought flour, salt pork, and a bag of dried apples, replenished her water barrels, and allowed herself one luxury, a piece of peppermint candy from the sutler's store, which she ate sitting on the wagon seat watching the cavalry horses and feeling, for the first time since Thomas died, something that was not quite happiness but was in the vicinity of it. Something like the possibility of happiness, held at arm's length but real. "You look like someone handed you the whole territory," said a voice. She did not spin this time. She had been half aware of him approaching, some instinct she was developing for the particular quality of his footsteps. Patrick Abbott was standing at the corner of the wagon, one hand resting on the side board, not quite looking at her and not quite looking away. "It is peppermint candy," she said. "Small pleasures." "Right," he said, and something happened at the corner of his mouth that was not exactly a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. "Would you like a piece?" She said it before she had decided to say it, which was unusual for her. He seemed surprised by this too, which she found oddly satisfying. He looked at the bag in her hand, then at her, then at the bag again. "I suppose I could," he said. She held out a piece and he took it, and for a moment they sat in a silence that was not uncomfortable, watching the cavalry horses and the bustle of the fort around them while the peppermint did its small, honest work. "Patrick Abbott," he said, finally, as if they had not already been traveling together for 2 weeks. "Rebecca Cooper," she replied in the same tone. "I know," he said. "I know you know," she said, another not quite smile. He turned his attention back to the horses in the parade ground, and she let him, and the silence between them was a different kind of silence than the one before. They left Fort Kearny the following morning, and the trail west changed character. The easy prairie roads gave way to something wilder, more demanding, the kind of landscape that reminded every traveler constantly that they were guests here at the land's tolerance, not the other way around. The Platte River Valley opened up around them, wide and shallow and perpetually dusty, the smell of sage and buffalo grass replacing the damp Missouri earth smell that had followed them out of Independence. Rebecca found her rhythm with the trail. She learned which of her oxen, whom she had named George and Henry, was prone to stubbornness on cold mornings and needed a different kind of coaxing than the other. She learned to read the sky for weather in the way Doyle read it, watching the particular formation of clouds to the southwest that preceded the worst of the afternoon thunderstorms. She learned to cook over a fire in wind, which was a genuine skill, and she learned to sleep deeply and quickly because sleep was the only resource the trail provided in abundance. She also, gradually, learned a few things about Patrick Abbott. He was from Tennessee originally, she gathered, from the particular cadence of certain words he let slip in the rare moments when he said more than strictly necessary. He had served in the war, on which side she did not ask and he did not say, because it was 1872, and on the trail West men made a habit of leaving that question buried. He knew a great deal about horses, more than almost anyone she had met, and he knew the land out here with the intimate familiarity of someone who had crossed it more than once. He was not a comfortable person. He did not make conversation easily and did not seem to feel the lack of it, and there was a guardedness about him that went deeper than shyness, a quality of someone who had made private decisions about what parts of themselves they allowed other people near. But he kept fixing things for her. That was the confounding part. It was never dramatic, never announced. Her water barrel developed a slow leak, and she spent a morning looking for the source before she found it plugged with pine pitch that had not been there the night before. A section of her canvas cover that had been working loose at the rear bow was relaced before she noticed it had come loose at all. When George, the stubborn ox, pulled up lame on a particularly cold morning, Patrick Abbott was there inside of 10 minutes with a poultice that he wrapped around the animal's leg with the ease of long practice, and when she tried to thank him he said simply, "Your wagon cannot afford to fall behind," and rode away. As if it were purely logistical, as if he were simply protecting the integrity of the column. She told Clara Marsh about it one evening while they were washing their cooking pots in a stream, and Clara listened with the bright, interested attention that was her natural mode of engagement with the world. "He sounds like a man who does things by doing them," Clara said, which was the kind of observation that sounded simple until you sat with it for a while. There are men who say and men who do, and in my experience the ones who do are considerably rarer. "I am not suggesting anything about him," Rebecca said carefully. "I am simply noting a pattern." "Of course," Clara said, with a smile that suggested she was noting a different pattern. The storm hit 3 days west of Fort Kearny on a Tuesday afternoon, coming out of the southwest exactly as the clouds had promised. It was not the worst storm the trail had seen, but it was bad enough. Lightning splitting the sky open every few seconds, hail that left welts on exposed skin, rain so heavy that the trail became a river of mud in minutes and visibility dropped to the length of a wagon. Doyle called a halt, and everyone scrambled to tie their animals and secure their loads and get whatever they could under cover. Rebecca's wagon cover held mostly, but a seam at the front corner opened under the force of the wind, and the rain came through in a steady sheet that soaked 3/4 of her flour supply before she could get it moved. She was in the back of the wagon, fighting the canvas with both hands and losing, when the flap at the front parted and Patrick Abbott was there, already soaked to the skin, with a length of rope in his hands that he was threading through the canvas rings before she had time to be surprised at his presence. "Hold that corner," he said, and she held it, and together they got the canvas secured while the hail hammered the outside of the wagon like gravel thrown by a careless god. When it was done, they were both sitting in the back of the wagon, rain-soaked and breathing hard, listening to the storm thunder and diminish around them. It was the closest they had ever been in proximity, close enough that she could see the particular dark amber color of his eyes in the gray storm light, close enough to notice that the guardedness he wore like a second skin had slipped just slightly in the urgency of the last 10 minutes, leaving behind something younger and less defended. "Your flour," he said, looking at the wet bags at the back of the wagon. "How much did you lose?" "Enough to matter," she said. "I can stretch what remains." He was quiet for a moment. "I have extra. I travel light on supplies because I ride, not haul. You can have what I do not need," She looked at him. He was looking at the wet flour bags with the focused attention he gave to problems. "That is too much," she said. "No," he said, "it is not. Why do you keep doing this?" She asked, and she heard the directness in her own voice, the same directness that had won the argument about Shakespeare and sold the farm and gotten her onto this wagon in the first place. He did not answer immediately. The rain was tapering, the hail already gone, the sky beginning to show a thin pale edge of aftermath at its western corner. He looked at his hands, then at the canvas wall of the wagon, and when he finally looked at her, there was something honest in it that she had not seen in him before. "You are out here alone," he said. "That is not a criticism. It takes more courage than most men have. But the trail does not care about courage, and it has a lot of ways to end a person. I know the trail. I can see what is coming before it arrives. It seems a waste not to use that." It was the longest thing he had said to her at one time. She held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile, turning it over to look at all its angles. "That is a generous explanation," she said. "It is the true one," he said, and there was a quality in the saying of it that made her believe him, and also believe that it was not the complete truth, and also understand that this was probably as much as she was going to get from him today, and that it was genuinely more than she had expected. "Thank you," she said, "for the canvas, for all of it." He nodded once, picked up his rope, and climbed out into the damp aftermath of the storm without another word. But she watched him go with a feeling in her chest that she recognized, dimly, as something she had not felt in a long time, something warm and tentative and complicated, like a fire that has been banked for so long you are not sure it can be brought up again. She did not let herself name it. Not yet. The company reached the crossing of the South Platte 12 days later, and the crossing itself was one of the great collective ordeals of the journey westward. The river was running high from the spring melt, wide and deceptively shallow in some places and treacherous in others, with a current that could swing a wagon sideways in seconds if the animals lost their footing. Doyle scouted the crossing himself in the morning, came back with a plan, and delivered it to the assembled company with the practiced authority of a man who had done this before and knew exactly how badly it could go. The wagons would cross one at a time. The mounted men would ride alongside to keep the animals steady. Everyone who could walk would walk, not ride, to reduce the weight. Rebecca walked across the South Platte with her skirts kilted to her knees, and the cold brown water pressing against her thighs with a force that was genuinely startling. One hand on George's harness and her eyes fixed on the far bank with the concentration of someone who knows that the moment you look at the current is the moment it takes you. She felt the river grab at her several times, testing her footing, and each time she planted her feet and held. She did not fall. George did not fall. Henry did not fall. The wagon crossed with everything in it. When she stepped up onto the far bank and turned to look back at the crossing, Patrick Abbott was there, just behind her, having crossed immediately after her wagon in case something had gone wrong that needed fixing. He looked at her from the saddle of his still dripping horse, and she looked up at him, and she was shaking slightly from the cold and the effort, but she was upright and she was across, and something passed between them in that look that did not have a word yet, but that she felt clearly nonetheless. "Good crossing," he said. "Thank you for the company," she said, meaning it as something more than just the sentence, and she thought from the way his eyes held hers for a half-second longer than usual that he understood it that way. The weeks accumulated. The landscape changed again, the flat plain giving way to the gradual rise toward the Rocky Mountains, the air thinning and drying, the vegetation shifting from tall grass to sage and juniper, and the occasional cluster of cottonwood along creek banks. The wagon train was a community now in the way that communities form only under shared difficulty. People who had been strangers in Missouri now knew each other's children's names and ailments and habits and fears. They shared food and labor and the particular dark humor of people who are tired and still have far to go. Rebecca settled into the community with a naturalness that surprised her a little. She had worried when she set out that the other families would pity her or exclude her for traveling alone. Instead, she found herself folded in, minding children while their parents handled crises, lending tools and receiving them back, sitting up late with Clara Marsh talking about everything and nothing in the comfortable way of women who have decided to be true friends. But she was also becoming aware, with increasing precision, of Patrick Abbott's movements around the edge of her world. Not because he was obvious about it, he was, in fact, the least obvious person she had ever met, but because she had become attuned to him in some way she could not have planned or predicted, the way you become attuned to a sound in the house at night, a creak or a breath, that over time stops being strange and starts being simply part of the texture of your sleeping. She noticed that he always positioned himself on the side of the column closest to her wagon when they were traveling through any ground that made him uneasy. Narrow canyons, river bends, the kind of terrain where trouble could hide with ease. She noticed that the 2 strangers had approached the wagon train, men appearing on horses from unexpected directions, with the particular quality of deliberateness that Doyle always called, having a purpose they're not sharing. Patrick Abbott had moved between those strangers and the middle of the column where her wagon traveled, subtly but unmistakably, like water finding the channel it needed. She did not say anything about this to him, partly because she was not certain of what she was seeing, and partly because she was not yet sure what she would do with his confirmation if it came. One evening, camped at a creek whose name nobody seemed to agree on, she made a full pot of stew with the dried beef and the last of the fresh vegetables she had been rationing for 2 weeks. And when it was done, she carried a second bowl across the camp to where Patrick Abbott was tending his horse at the picket line. He looked at the bowl with an expression that cycled through surprise, suspicion, and something gentler in about 3 seconds. "I made too much," she said, which was true in the technical sense and a lie in the full sense. "It is better than going to waste." He took the bowl. He sat down on a nearby rock and ate with the focused, grateful attention of someone who has been eating trail food for weeks and knows what good cooking tastes like when it arrives. She sat on the ground nearby and pretended to be interested in the creek, giving him the privacy of not being watched, which she had come to understand was important to him. "Where are you going?" he asked when the bowl was half empty. "In Oregon." "Where specifically?" "The Willamette Valley," she said. "There is a land agent who corresponds with settlers. He has parcels available near a town called Salem. I intend to farm." "Alone?" "To start with," she said. "I am not entirely without resources. I was managing 40 acres in Missouri before Thomas died." "Thomas was your husband?" "Yes." She said it without the particular weight that it had carried in February and noticed the difference. "He was a good man. The fever took him in the winter. He did not deserve it." Patrick Abbott was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "The ones who deserve it rarely get it, and the ones who don't keep getting it anyway. The trail makes that much clear." There was something personal in that. She felt sure of it. Something that referred to a specific experience rather than a general observation. But she did not ask. She was learning the particular patience that he seemed to require, the willingness to let things come at their own pace rather than pulling them out before they were ready. "What about you?" she asked instead. "When we reach Oregon, what do you do then?" He looked at the creek. "Haven't decided," he said. "You are not a scout by profession," she said. It was not quite a question. She had been piecing things together slowly, the way you piece together a puzzle when you only have half the pieces, and this was one of the things she had come to feel fairly certain of. He set the empty bowl down on the rock beside him. "No," he said, "not by profession." He looked at her, and there it was again, that quality of something honest pushing against the guardedness like a river against a dam. "I have been other things. Some of them I am not proud of. This, right now, I am not embarrassed by." She considered that for a long moment. "Then it seems like a good place to be," she said. "Right now." He looked at her with an expression that was new, something she had not seen before, something that mixed gratitude and surprise and something warmer underneath both of them, and he held her gaze for long enough that she felt the warmth of it in her own chest, and then he looked back at the creek. "Thank you for the stew," he said. "It was very good." She retrieved the bowl and walked back to her wagon and sat by her own fire for a long time afterward, thinking about rivers against dams and the particular patience required to wait for the water to find its way through. The thing she had been not naming was getting harder to leave unnamed. Word reached them from a party coming the opposite direction, eastbound with hollow eyes and two light wagons, that there had been raids on immigrant trains ahead. Not Comanche or Arapaho activity. The raids in this stretch were from a band of road agents, men who preyed on the wagon trains with the organized ruthlessness of people who had decided that robbery was simply a business model. They had hit 2 trains ahead of them. Nobody killed, but supplies and valuables stripped, animals sometimes taken, people left frightened and diminished and much worse off for the encounter. Doyle called a meeting that evening and relayed the information in his usual direct fashion and proposed a plan. Tighter formation, fires positioned to maximize visibility, and the hired riders maintaining double watches through the next several nights until they were through the region where the raids had occurred. Rebecca sat at the edge of the gathering and watched Patrick Abbott across the circle of assembled travelers. He was listening to Doyle with the focused attention of someone who is simultaneously processing what they are hearing and what they already know, and she realized with a clarity that was almost physical that he had already been aware of this threat. The way he had been riding the column, the places he had positioned himself, the quality of his watchfulness in the last several days. It had already shifted, already tightened, in ways she was now able to read. He had been managing this threat without saying a word about it. Not to her specifically, not to anyone, just managing it quietly from the outside. She looked away before he could catch her watching him. The next 3 nights were the tensest of the journey. The second night, a party of 4 riders appeared from the east along the trail well after midnight and approached the sleeping camp with a slowness that had nothing casual about it. And it was Patrick Abbott on the North Watch who rode out to meet them at a distance, alone. And whatever happened out there in the dark took about 15 minutes and ended with the 4 riders turning their horses around and going back the way they had come. And in the morning, there were no signs that anything had happened, except that Patrick Abbott looked like a man who had not slept and was working on the principle that sleep was optional anyway. Rebecca found him at the horse line in the gray morning light and handed him a cup of coffee. He took it without pretending he did not know what she was doing. "You heard," he said. "I was awake," she said. "Not everyone sleeps through everything." He drank the coffee in several long swallows and handed the cup back. "They are gone, further east. We are through the worst of it." "Were you afraid?" she asked. He considered the question seriously rather than dismissing it, which she had come to understand was one of the things about him that distinguished him from men who wore their composure like a shell. "There is always something that feels like fear," he said. "It tells you to pay attention. You use it and then you set it aside." "That sounds like something a man learns from experience," she said. "A lot of experience," he said, without irony or pride, just simple statement of fact. She wanted to ask him what kind of experience. She wanted to ask him about Kansas, about what the sharp-featured man Decker had claimed he knew, about the past that sat behind his eyes like a closed room she could see the door of but not open. But she looked at him in the gray morning light, drinking the last of the coffee she had made for him, and what she saw was a man who was here now doing this, and the question of what the room behind the closed door contained seemed suddenly much less important than the man standing in front of her. "Eat something," she said instead, and went back to her wagon. They reached Fort Laramie in Wyoming Territory on a warm day in late June, and the fort was a different thing from Kearney. Older, larger, more worn in, with the layered history of a place that had been a trading post and a treaty site and a military installation all in sequence, so that its walls seemed to contain the memories of every person who had passed through them on their way somewhere else. The wagon train rested there for 3 days, which Doyle called a luxury and everyone treated as a small miracle. Rebecca wrote 2 letters, one to Mrs. Hartwell in Missouri telling her she was alive and well, and one to the land agent in Salem, Oregon, confirming her intent to arrive by autumn. She traded her extra candle wax for a small mirror at the sutler's store and used it to look at her own face for the first time in weeks. She looked, she thought, like the trail, real and weathered and more herself than she had been before she started. On the second evening at Laramie, there was a social gathering of the kind that wagon trains always generated when they had an excuse to pause. A fire, a fiddle, some dancing on the packed earth of the fort's parade ground, the kind of easy shared pleasure that tired people needed badly and that the frontier could provide when it chose to be generous. Rebecca danced. She danced with the minister's husband, who was earnest and slightly clumsy, and with one of the cattle-dreaming brothers, who was better, and with a cavalry sergeant who asked with elaborate politeness, and danced with the careful precision of a man who has been taught rather than born to it. She was enjoying herself in the uncomplicated way of someone who has decided to be present in the moment, and the music was good, and the night was warm, and she was across the South Platte and through the Raider country and still going. She saw Patrick Abbott at the edge of the firelight. He was standing apart from the gathering in his usual fashion, and he was watching her dance, and when she caught his eye, the expression on his face was one she had not seen before, something unguarded and wanting, and quickly shuddered, but not before she had seen it, not before it registered in her chest with a warmth that spread outward in all directions. She excused herself from the next dance and walked to the edge of the firelight. "You do not dance," she said. It was not a judgment. "Not usually," he said. "Would you like to?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the internal argument happening, the guardedness pulling one way and something else pulling the other, and she waited with the patience she had learned on his account. "All right," he said. He could dance. She was not sure why this surprised her, except that it was one of those things that does not fit the picture you have been assembling, and when it doesn't fit you have to revise the picture, and she found she was happy to revise it. He danced with the same economy of motion with which he did everything, no excess, no performance, but it was right and it was real, and his hand on her waist was warm and steady, and he held her at a proper distance, but it was a distance that felt like a choice rather than an obligation. "You are full of surprises, Mr. Abbott," she said. "Patrick," he said, "you have been calling me Mr. Abbott in your head. I can tell." She laughed genuinely, the first real laugh she could remember in months, and she felt it travel through her like something loosened, some long-held tightness releasing its grip. "Fine," she said. "Patrick." "Rebecca," he said, and the way he said it was quiet and careful, like something handled with respect. They danced 2 dances and then stood at the edge of the firelight talking about nothing important for the better part of an hour. The trail ahead, the mountains, the way the sky in Wyoming territory was a different color than any sky she had seen before, deeper and wider, somehow, as if more sky were available here than anywhere else. He was different in this firelight than in any other light. Something in him that usually deflected contact seeming to have stepped aside for the evening, and she let herself be there with him without worrying about what it meant or where it was going. When she walked back to the wagon to sleep, she was smiling, and she kept the smile until she fell asleep. The mountains arrived. She had known, intellectually, that they were there. She had read the guidebooks, had talked to people who had crossed before, had looked at the illustrations in the almanac her neighbor had lent her. But knowing that the Rocky Mountains exist, and then arriving at the base of them on a June morning with a covered wagon and 2 oxen are entirely different experiences, and the second one had a magnitude that the first could not prepare you for. The South pass through the Continental Divide was the great mercy of the immigrant trail, the gradual approach that made crossing the Rockies possible for wagons rather than just for mountain men and their pack animals. But even the mercy of the pass required weeks of ascending grades that pushed the animals to their limits, roads that were rock and rut and treachery in equal measure, mornings so cold that the water in the barrels had ice on it by dawn. Rebecca leaned into it. That was the only language the mountains spoke. Effort, and more effort, and the willingness to keep going when your body was suggesting other options. She walked beside her wagon on the steepest grades to spare the oxen. She learned to brake on the descents by means of the drag chain and her own judgment about when to apply it. She ate less, worked more, slept the exhausted sleep of someone who has burned everything available. Patrick Abbott was there for all of it, but he was there in the way the mountains were there. Present, large, part of the landscape. He helped where he could without making her feel helped in a way that diminished anything. When George slipped on a wet rock face and nearly went down, Patrick was there in seconds with a hand on the animal's harness and a steadying voice, and George came back up and kept going. When a section of road had slid away in a recent storm and needed to be detoured, and the detour required physically lifting the rear of several wagons over a boulder, Patrick Abbott worked alongside the men of the company for 2 hours without complaint and without remark. She brought him coffee in the mornings now, routinely, and he received it routinely, and neither of them made a point of this, but both of them were aware of it as the kind of routine that means something beyond the gesture itself. They talked in the evenings sometimes, not always, because sometimes he needed quiet and she had learned to read when that was true and to leave him to it without making him explain. And sometimes he would simply come and sit near her fire without being asked and without much conversation, and she found that she liked that just as much as the talking. She was in love with him. She admitted this to herself on a cold, clear morning somewhere in the mountains with the continental divide behind them and the whole western slope of the continent ahead. It was not the passionate, consuming love of youth. She had had that with Thomas, and it was a different thing from this. This was the kind of love that grew from watching a person in difficulty and then in ease, from knowing the way they moved and the way they were quiet, and the way their eyes looked when they thought nobody was watching them. This was the love that surprised you by being already there when you finally turned to look at it, fully formed, having grown in the patient and unannounced way of things that intend to last. She did not know if he felt the same way. She thought he might. She was not certain enough to act on it. He still had not told her about Kansas, about whatever Decker had implied. She had been living for weeks with the knowledge that there was a door she had not opened, and she was starting to feel the weight of what she did not know pressing against the certainty of what she did. She did not let it change what she knew of him, which was this. He was careful and capable and honest in the particular way of people who have been dishonest before and decided against it. He was genuinely, thoroughly kind in the way that required no audience. He had been protecting her wagon and her safety from the first day of the trail, in ways she was still discovering. And he had looked at her from the edge of a firelight in Fort Laramie with an expression that she had replayed many times since, and that always resolved, no matter how she examined it, into the same clear thing. Oregon was getting closer. She found herself thinking about that as an ache rather than a relief. They descended through the blue mountains of Oregon in August, the air turning green and fragrant with pine, the whole landscape softening from the austerity of the high desert into something that looked, with increasing conviction, like the place the guidebooks had described. The Willamette Valley was still ahead, but the quality of the light and the smell of the air were already making promises. The wagon train was smaller now. 2 families had stopped in Idaho territory, one to tend a sick child, one because they had simply looked at the land and decided it was close enough to what they wanted. The minister and Clara Marsh were still with the column, bound for the valley as Rebecca was, and their friendship had deepened into the kind that would survive geography. The cattle-dreaming brothers were still there. The sharp-featured Decker had turned off somewhere in Wyoming without ceremony or goodbye. Rebecca thought about Patrick Abbott's ending. She could not help it. Every mile closer to Salem was a mile closer to the moment when the wagon train reached its destination and dispersed, and everyone went their separate ways into the new lives they had come here to build. She did not know what his separate way looked like or where it went, and she was afraid to find out and equally afraid of not finding out. She had almost said something to him a dozen times in the last 2 weeks, and each time she had pulled back, held by the same uncertainty. That she did not know everything about him, that the closed room in his past was still closed, and that she could not fully commit herself to a feeling without that knowledge, not because she was afraid of his past, but because she needed to know that he trusted her enough to share it. The last campfire before they reached the outskirts of Salem was on a flat piece of ground near a creek, the kind of beautiful, peaceful camp that made all the hardship of the journey feel like a fair trade. The families gathered around the big central fire in a mood of tired celebration, the kind of mood that comes from knowing you have done the hard thing and it is nearly over. Someone had a bottle of whiskey. Clara Marsh's husband said a prayer of thanks that was brief and honest and moved several people to quiet tears. Rebecca sat beside her own fire, apart from the gathering, and was trying to decide something. She heard his footsteps before he arrived. She always did now. Patrick Abbott sat down across the fire from her, and he looked at her with the expression she had come to read as him being about to say something he had been working up to. And before he could, she said, "Tell me." He looked at her. "Tell you what?" "Whatever it is," she said, "that you have not told me. I need to hear it." The fire crackled between them. The sound of the celebration at the main camp drifted through the dark like something from another world. He was quiet for so long that she thought he was going to retreat, was going to pull the guardedness back over himself like armor, and then he took a long, deliberate breath and he told her. His name was Patrick Abbott, and 3 years ago in Kansas, he had ridden with a man named Cutter, who ran a group of men along the eastern Kansas roads, taking what they needed from whoever had it. Patrick had joined them when he was young and broke and not particular about the means to the end. He had been with Cutter for 2 years. He had robbed stagecoaches. He had robbed a bank in a small town called Meridian. He had not, he said this slowly and with the particular emphasis of someone distinguishing carefully, ever hurt anyone directly. He had held guns on people, and he knew that a gun held on a person is its own kind of harm, and he did not minimize it. But nobody had been shot by Patrick Abbott. The violence that Cutter's group had done, and there had been violence, had been done by other men, and the moment Patrick had understood that violence was going to be the direction of travel, he had left. He had left and he had walked away, and he had been walking away from it ever since, and somewhere in that walking he had found that there were things he was good at that didn't require taking from people. He knew the trail. He knew horses. He knew how to watch for danger and how to manage it before it arrived. So that was what he did. He hired himself to Doyle for this crossing not because he needed the money, which he did, but because somewhere in the listing of purposes available to him, this one felt like something that was going toward something rather than away from it. He stopped talking. The fire spoke for a moment, and the celebration from the other camp drifted past, and the creek made its small, honest sound, and Rebecca held everything he had said in the quiet of her own consideration. "Have you made right whatever restitution was possible?" she asked. He looked at her sharply, not expecting that question from that angle. "The bank in Meridian," he said slowly. "I sent what I had. It was not everything, but it was more than half. The rest I intend to settle when I have it." She nodded. "You are not angry," he said, and it was somewhere between a statement and a disbelief. "I did not say that," she said. "I am turning it over. That is different from anger." "You have a right to be angry," he said. "I have been riding next to your wagon for months, and you repaired my axle the first week," she said. "And you plugged my water barrel and relaced my canvas, and got my flour out of the rain, and kept a band of road agents away from this wagon train, and probably saved at least 2 or 3 people from serious harm by seeing trouble before it arrived." She was looking at him directly across the fire, not accusing, just accounting. "I know what you have been doing, Patrick. I have known for a long time, not everything, but enough." He was very still. "I did not know it all until right now," she said. "That is true, but knowing it now, knowing all of it, I need you to understand something." She stopped, steadied herself, because what came next was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in a very long time. I have been in love with you since somewhere around the South Platte crossing, and I am still in love with you sitting right here with everything you've just told me, and I would rather have all of the truth than half of it any day. He stared at her across the fire. The guardedness was completely gone. She could see exactly what he felt nakedly, without any of the deflection he had maintained for months, and what she saw was a man who had been carrying the weight of his own history alone for a very long time, and who had perhaps believed, in the private logic of a person accustomed to considering themselves undeserving, that the weight of it would be too much for anyone else. "Rebecca," he said. "I am here," she said. He came around the fire to her side, not hurrying, moving with that economy and deliberateness that was simply who he was, and he sat beside her and he took her hands in both of his, and he looked at her with everything showing on his face, gratitude and love and the particular quality of a person who has been handed something they were afraid to ask for. "I have wanted to tell you for months," he said quietly. "I started more than a dozen times." "I know," she said. "I was listening for it. I was afraid of what you would think of me." "I think," she said carefully, "that you are the most careful and capable and quietly devoted person I have ever met, and I think that what you were before is a great deal less important than what you have been doing since, and I think that I would very much like to know what you intend to do now." He looked at their joined hands, then at her face. "There is land in the valley," he said. "I have been thinking about it. I know something about farming. My father had a farm in Tennessee before the war." "I thought," he stopped. "Say it," she said. "I thought perhaps it might be possible," he said, "to do this alongside someone, if that someone would have me." She felt the smile coming from somewhere deep and warm. "I happen to know of a land agent near Salem with parcels available," she said. He looked at her with a disbelief that was turning into something else, something bright and overwhelming, and he raised one of her hands and pressed it to his lips with a tenderness so precise and complete that she felt it travel all the way through her. And she leaned her forehead against his and felt his breath warm against her skin, and the fire crackled and the creek spoke, and the darkness around them was full of stars. "I have been watching your wagon since the first day," he said against her hair. "I could not help it. I saw you and I thought, there is someone who is going to make it all the way, and I want to be the reason the trail leaves her alone." "And did you think anything else about me?" she asked. He laughed softly, the first time she had heard him laugh in all these months, and it was a good sound, real and warm and genuine. "Yes," he said, "considerably more than I knew how to say." She pulled back just enough to look at him, and she saw the man she had been assembling piece by piece for 5 months, and she saw that the picture was complete now, every piece in its place, and she loved what she saw. "Then say it now," she said. "We have time." "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since the first time you offered me peppermint candy like it was the most natural thing in the world, and I was worth offering it to." She kissed him then, by the fire on the last night of the trail, with the Willamette Valley a day's travel ahead and a whole new life waiting at the edge of it. And it was a kiss that meant everything it was supposed to mean. The end of the journey and the beginning of something else. The closing of a chapter so long and hard that you almost forgot chapters could close. The morning came clean and cold and golden, the way Oregon mornings seemed to be constitutionally disposed to arriving, and the wagon train made its final day's travel into the outskirts of Salem with the combined energy of people who have been holding anticipation in reserve for 5 months and are finally allowed to spend it. There were children running alongside the wagons, and people standing at the sides of the road watching them come in, and the smell of wood smoke and freshly turned earth and possibility. Doyle shook every hand at the head of the column as people peeled off toward their individual destinations, and when he got to Rebecca, he held her hand a moment longer than the rest and said, gruffly, "You done well, Mrs. Cooper. Better than most," which was the finest compliment she had ever received from a man who charged by the word. The land agent's name was Mr. Harlow, a thin, precise man who kept meticulous records and who was, it turned out, delighted to meet Rebecca Cooper, as her letters had preceded her, and he had a parcel that she was going to like. It was 80 acres in the valley proper, with good water and south-facing slopes, and the remnant of a structure that had been started by a previous settler who had changed his mind and gone back east, which was a foundation, and one standing wall but which was considerably more than nothing. Patrick Abbott stood beside her in Harlow's office, and when Harlow looked at him with a question in the look, Rebecca said, "My partner," which was not precisely a legal description but was as complete a truth as she knew how to offer at that particular moment. Harlow looked back at her, then at Patrick, then made a small, professionally neutral expression and showed them both the maps. They rode out to the parcel that afternoon, the two of them, on horses borrowed from the livery, and stood in the middle of what was going to be their land and looked at it from every angle. The valley was everything the letters had promised, wide and green and productive-looking, with a line of Douglas fir along the northern edge and the arc of a creek through the lower corner of the property, and a view of the mountains to the east that was staggering in the late afternoon light. "It is beautiful," she said. "It is," he agreed. "We will need to build before autumn," she said. "The foundation is there. I brought nails and hardware in the wagon. We will need timber." "There is a mill 8 miles north," he said. He had already been paying attention. "I spoke to a man at the livery who knows the valley." She looked at him sideways. "You have been planning." "I have been hoping," he said, which was a different thing, and they both knew it. She reached for his hand and he gave it to her, and they stood in the valley light with the land spreading away in all directions and their whole lives arranged in the future ahead of them. And Rebecca Cooper felt the kind of peace that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the presence of exactly the right person standing beside you in it. They were married in October of that year, in the church that the Reverend Marsh had established in Salem, which was still more of a large room with pews than a proper church building, but which had a warmth and a genuine holiness about it that Rebecca found far more moving than any grand cathedral might have been. Clara Marsh cried with the happy completeness of someone who has been hoping for a thing for months and is now watching it arrive. Doyle, who was in Salem for the winter before taking another train east in spring, attended with the gruff sentimentality of a man who would deny being sentimental and was fooling no one. Patrick Abbott said his vows in a clear, steady voice with his eyes on Rebecca's face, and she said hers in the same way, and the exchange was so direct and so honest that it made the room quiet in the particular way of witnessing something real. That winter, they built the house. It was hard work, the kind of winter work that starts before full light and ends after dark, and they did most of it themselves with help from neighbors who were the particular kind of generous that frontier communities generated. Help freely given because everyone understood that their turn to need it would come. The Marsh family helped raise the main walls. One of the cattle-dreaming brothers, who had established his ranch 12 miles south and whose name was Edward, rode over for a full week and proved to be an excellent carpenter. The house went up, 3 rooms to start, with a proper fireplace and a wood floor that Rebecca insisted on and Patrick built with the focused, patient precision he brought to everything. By January they had a roof and 4 walls and a door that actually closed against the weather, and they sat inside by the fire on the night the last shingle went on, and the wind outside tested the walls and found them sound. "Thomas would have liked this house," she said quietly. It was the first time she had said his name in a while, and she said it without grief, with only the clean quality of an honest memory. Patrick was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like he was worth that kind of remembering," he said. "He was," she said, "and you are worth yours." He looked at her in the firelight with that expression she had first seen in Fort Laramie, the one with the wanting in it but open now, unguarded, belonging fully to her. "Tell me something," he said. "What?" "The axle," he said. "The first time. Did you know it was me before you turned around?" She smiled. "I was beginning to suspect," she said. "You had a particular quality when you moved. I had noticed it." "Had you?" he said. "From the first morning," she said, "you were worth noticing." He pulled her close in the way he always did, with a care that was also a certainty, and she leaned into him with the ease of someone who has found the place where they fit, and the fire spoke and the wind went around the walls of the house that they had built, and the valley outside was dark and quiet and enormous. In the spring, Rebecca planted 20 acres of wheat and 12 of vegetables, and she did it correctly, because she knew what she was doing and always had, and the valley soil was everything the land agent had said it was. Patrick broke ground alongside her and proved to be, as he had said, a man who knew farming, and they worked in a partnership so natural and efficient that the neighbors remarked on it. He also rode down to the county sheriff's office in Salem in April and sat across a desk from a quiet, careful lawman named Reed and made a full accounting of what he had done in Kansas and offered what further restitution he was able to make. Sheriff Reed listened, made his notes, wrote 2 letters east, and told Patrick Abbott that Kansas had closed that particular investigation the previous year, partly because the witnesses had scattered and partly because the evidence was thinner than Cutter had always believed, and that as far as Oregon was concerned, no warrants existed for him in this territory. Patrick walked out of that office into the April sun and stood on the boardwalk of Salem, Oregon, with the weight of 3 years lifted from him, and he stayed there for a long moment just breathing, and then he walked home to the valley. He told Rebecca that evening, and she sat across the dinner table from him and listened to all of it, and when he was done she reached across the table and took his hand. "Good," she said. "Now it is done." "Now it is done," he agreed. In the summer she discovered she was expecting a child, and she received this news with the full, complex range of feeling that it warranted. Joy and anxiety and the poignant awareness that Thomas had always hoped for children and had not lived to see them, and then the deeper, cleaner joy of knowing that this child was Patrick's, and that he would be a father of tremendous quality because he was the kind of man who paid attention to what mattered and showed up for it without being asked. She told him on a warm evening in July, while they were sitting on the porch of the house, watching the valley turn gold in the setting sun. She said it simply and directly, because that was always how she said things, and Patrick Abbott went still in the way he sometimes went still when something came through his careful defenses and reached him directly. And then he turned to look at her with an expression that she could only describe as overwhelmed in the most beautiful possible sense, like a man who had not known he had room for this much feeling, and was discovering, with some astonishment, that he did. He put his arms around her very carefully, as if she were something invaluable, which she told him afterward was unnecessary because she was extremely sturdy and had crossed the South Platte on foot and could manage being embraced. "I know," he said. "I know you are. He stopped." "I know," she said. Their son was born in February 1874, delivered by a capable midwife who served the valley settlements. They named him William, after Patrick's father, and he arrived in the world with the healthy opinion of someone who intends to be heard, which he expressed at considerable volume for the first hour of his life. Patrick held his son with the same economy and precision he brought to everything physical, but his face, watching this small, furious, perfect person in his arms, was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. Every wall down, every room open, just a man with his child struck through with love. "Hello," Patrick said to his son, very quietly as if introducing himself. "I am your father. I intend to be very much present." Rebecca, exhausted and completely happy, watched from the bed and felt the completeness of the moment settle over her like something permanent. This was it. This was the life she had packed herself into a wagon for, the life she had crossed rivers and mountains and high desert for, the life that had been waiting at the end of the trail she had chosen when everything else felt impossible. And the man holding her son was the man she had not known she was going to find, the man who had been quietly and faithfully making sure she got here safe enough to find it. Edward, who had come to think of himself as family by this point, and whose cattle ranch was prospering at the southern end of the valley, came to see the baby with a bottle of excellent whiskey and the particular beaming pride of a man who has decided to be an honorary uncle. Clara Marsh brought food and her own bright, encompassing joy. Even old Doyle, passing through Salem in the spring on his way to take another train east, stopped at the farm and looked at William with an expression that softened the granite of his face considerably. "You are a very long way from Missouri," he said to Rebecca. "Yes," she said. "It turned out to be exactly far enough. The farm grew. The wheat grew. William grew, gaining weight and personality in equal measure, revealing himself to be a child of direct opinions and considerable charm, and an already evident love of horses that delighted his father deeply. By the summer of 1874, they had added 10 acres of orchard to the farm, apple and pear trees that would take years to produce, but that would last long after them, and Patrick had built a barn of which he was quietly very proud. In the evenings, when William was asleep in his cradle and the valley was quiet, they sat on the porch and talked about everything, about what they had come from and what they were building, about the things Patrick had never expected to have, and the things Rebecca had feared she might not find again. They talked about Thomas with the honesty and the tenderness that was possible now, the clean grief that no longer stabbed but simply held its place in the honest accounting of things. They talked about the trail, about the crossing, about the particular quality of the South Platte and the mountains in the morning and the camp at Laramie where they had first danced. One evening in August, when the last of the sun was burning the western edge of the valley, Patrick said, "You did not know, did you, for a long time?" "About all of it. About what you were doing," she said. "Protecting the wagon, no, not all of it, not until you told me." "Does it change anything?" he asked. Not the earlier question, not the old uncertainty, just curiosity, real curiosity about how she held it. "It explains everything," she said. "The axle, the water barrel, the canvas in the storm, the road agents, all of it, it explains the whole journey." "I did not know how to say it," he said. "Any of it, the protection or the other thing." "The other thing being that you were in love with me since approximately Fort Kearny," she said. He considered this. "Earlier," he said. "If I am being accurate," she smiled. "How much earlier? The peppermint candy," he said. She laughed. She had a full, real laugh that she had rediscovered on the trail and that she intended to continue using for the rest of her life. And it rang out across the porch and into the valley evening, and a dog barked somewhere to the south, and William stirred briefly in his cradle inside before settling again. "You were worth the whole trail," he said, not for dramatic effect, just because it was true. She leaned against his shoulder. "So were you," she said. The letters she had expected from the East eventually came. Letters from old neighbors in Missouri, amazed that she had actually gone. Letters from the county back home asking after the farm's deed transfer. Letters from Mrs. Hartwell, who had herself been considering a move to Kansas and wanted advice. Rebecca answered every one of them fully and honestly because that was her nature, and she always included, somewhere near the end, a description of the valley in the current season, the particular quality of the light or the smell of the blossoms or the way the mountains looked with their first snow of autumn. She told Mrs. Hartwell in one letter, writing from the porch of a house she had helped build on 80 acres of the Willamette Valley, with her husband inside putting their son to bed, and the evening laying itself across the mountains in colors she still had not found adequate words for, and she was as well as she had ever been in her life, which was better than she had any right to expect, and exactly what she had any right to hope for. Their second child came in the autumn of 1875, a girl this time, small and dark-haired, and possessed from the first breath of a quality of focused attention that made Patrick look at her, and then at Rebecca, with an expression of slightly overwhelmed recognition. "She is going to be like you," he said. "God help you both," said Rebecca, and then held her daughter and was quiet with the particular silence of someone receiving a gift they have not exactly prayed for because they did not know it was possible, the best kind of gift, the kind that arrives without being asked. They named her Clara, for the minister's wife whose friendship had held Rebecca steady through the long months of the trail. And Clara Marsh was there at the naming with tears on her face, and a genuine pride of having given her name to someone who was clearly going to do something worthwhile with it. Patrick Abbott settled into fatherhood with the same focused, patient care with which he approached everything he decided to do. He was not a demonstrative man in the public way, but he was present in the thorough, consistent way that mattered more, the way that showed up in the mornings when the children needed someone, and in the evenings when they needed to be heard, and in the middle of the night when William had a nightmare and Patrick was there before Rebecca had fully woken, his voice low and certain in the dark, telling his son that the dream was not real and that he was here. The farm by 1876 was a genuine success. The wheat was reliable, the orchard had begun to bear, and Patrick had added a small herd of cattle that he managed with the help of a young man from the neighboring settlement who was learning the work and doing well at it. They were not wealthy, but they were secure, which on the frontier is a kind of wealth, and they were comfortable in the particular way of people who have built something real and know the cost of it. Rebecca taught school for 2 mornings a week in the settlement hall 3 miles down the valley road, because the children needed teaching and she had always had an aptitude for it. And she carried William with her in the early months, and then left him with Patrick and the young ranch hand. And she taught reading and arithmetic and a little geography, and a great deal of the particular approach to the world that said you can figure most things out if you pay attention and do not give up. She kept the guidebook from the Missouri journey in the house, on the shelf above the fireplace, not because she needed it, but because she found that looking at it occasionally gave her a useful feeling, the feeling of having been somewhere difficult and come through it. The whole journey in a spine-cracked book that smelled of the prairie and had a water stain on the lower right corner from the South Platte crossing. She had come 2,000 miles and buried one life and built another, and found a man she had not been looking for and been found by him in return, both of them doing the finding sideways, and gradually, in the manner of people who are afraid of the direct approach but get there eventually. And what they had arrived at was better and realer than anything either of them had been able to imagine at the beginning. On the evening of their 4th anniversary, in October 1876, they walked out to the edge of the property together after the children were asleep, to the rise at the north end where the Douglas fir trees stood, and the whole valley was visible below in the last of the light, wide and green and golden, the creek making its thread of silver through the lower fields, the mountains beyond it purple in the dusk. They stood there in the way they had always stood together in the good moments, close but unhurried, taking it in without performing the taking. "Do you remember what you said to me?" Rebecca said. "On the last night of the trail." "I said several things," he said. "It was a significant evening." "You said I was worth the whole trail," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the valley. "I stand by that," he said. "So do I," she said. "Both directions." He looked at her. She looked at him. The valley held them in its enormous, particular western light, and the evening came on slowly around them, and there was nothing unfinished between them, nothing unresolved, nothing left waiting in the dark. It was all here. The house behind them and the children sleeping in it, and the 80 acres of valley soil that they had worked and shaped together, and the life that had come of the courage to climb into a wagon and go. Patrick took her hand, the way he always did, with care and certainty, and she held it the way she always did, with the full grip of someone who knows the value of what she is holding, and the sun went down behind the mountains, and the first stars opened in the Oregon sky. The whole West lay behind them now, all of it, every mile and every crossing, every storm and every dark camp and every morning that had required something more than she thought she had. It lay behind them like a road that has done its work, like a story that has found its ending. This was the ending. The two of them in the valley, holding hands in the dark, with their children asleep and their land around them, and a whole future arranged ahead like a landscape not yet fully seen, but already full of light.